Hello and welcome, everyone. Am I coming through clearly? We are experiencing a bit of a windstorm here, so we could be cut at any moment, fingers crossed. But at any rate, I am joined today by Professor and Congressional Candidate Liam O'Meara. Professor, did you want to introduce yourself for the audience?
Hi, sure. Just the basics. So, yeah, I'm Liam O'Meara, and I am a historian of ideas, and I focus on the cultural history of the Middle East and Europe. And I'm also the congressional candidate for the 42nd in Southwest Riverside County in California.
Thank you very much. So there were two things I wanted to discuss these days. I was particularly interested, partially because my own favorite professor in college was a professor of Middle Eastern politics, but also because you have the strange distinction, and again, we'll talk about why this is a strange distinction and why that matters, of being an actual expert with a PhD running for office. So there's two things broadly I wanted to discuss these days, and the first one, of course, is problems within the university itself that have a noxious impact, I should say, on life outside of academia, in politics or wherever else. And then continuing from that, the second thing I wanted to get your thoughts on is how, or if maybe you disagree, academia has generally failed at productively engaging the right wing in virtually every country, certainly in the English-speaking world, but also far afield from it, and what we can do to improve the situation. So just to get the ball rolling, it's interesting to me that you can run as a professor with that being a novelty. The most powerful office in the world is, of course, currently occupied by a television personality, and it's not the first time this has been the case. And meanwhile, the biggest disseminators of political opinions are largely worse educated and 1,000 times more noxious than your average second-year undergraduate.
Right.
So as a political scientist, this terrifies me. So as a serious professor who is in politics, and I've seen your conversations with Destiny and whatnot, which I, by the way, to the audience, highly recommend you check out after this. It's a very good conversation. But long story short, you are a serious scholar. And while there are certain people in politics who use their credentials cynically and really don't know what they're talking about, or just come at it with an elitist and entitled attitude, that doesn't seem to be the case with you. So I really want to know from your experience, what are your thoughts on what are the major barriers to actual experts getting into positions of authority or influence in politics, both in terms of your own country and generally, if you have thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the single biggest factors you'll run into is just how dirty politics can be, how money dependent it is, just how thoroughly corrupted the entire system is. And this is partly a problem with our party system in the US, but largely an issue more of the fundraising and the way it's sort of corrupted everything and the massive costs there. And a lot of people in academia, I got to say, are, like me, reflexively honest and not really interested in or good at playing the political game, so to speak. And I walk a really fine line there because I'm exceedingly honest with people about things, but you still try to, motivate people and give them, an optimistic view of things rather than being a constant downer. And that, of course, is problematic always for a historian. I try to maintain a cheery disposition, but I study a lot of genuinely depressing stuff.
Yeah,
it is tough, and you run into a real problem. I mean, just look at how bad the fundraising can often be in races like mine, especially if you're going to commit yourself to clean money. You'll get outspent at best 10-1.
Yeah,
and doing that does make it difficult to win. It absolutely can be done, but it's not easy to do, and a lot of academics just don't have the patience for that kind of work.
Yeah, and I expect also, like, you're at an inherent disadvantage in that, because you're serious and because you're honest, and more than anything because you're careful, your positions are going to take just a tremendously greater deal of effort to present than somebody who's not.
Right.
They only need to reflect the lowest common denominator. You have to try and bring people up. That's exceedingly difficult, even when you're not running for office.
I have to present a much more nuanced position in general, and I am at a serious messaging disadvantage because the right has consistently outmaneuvered the left for decades in the United States, and there's a tremendous amount of propaganda out there that affects even the Democratic electorate that make it very difficult to talk about some truly fundamental issues. So you have to really take a step back and then spend some time actually trying to educate the electorate. And that's generally not something you see much in politics anymore. It used to be, it just isn't now. And again, it gets to a real issue of the investments really involved in doing so. I mean, the difficulty in doing so. And if you have to spend so much time trying to dial for dollars, so to speak, just to keep the operation running, how much time do you really have to engage there? It's always a tough balancing act.
Absolutely. And you were talking about just a moment ago before we started the stream that after this, at some point today, you're going to be grading papers. So you're still working as a professor. Meanwhile, all this is going on.
Oh, yeah. I put in 80-hour weeks for the last 2 years.
Yeah. I can believe that. And in fact, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today was just the burnout that academics face, especially when they try to engage in politics, not just because of like the demoralization of how corrupt the public discourse has become, but also just because the university institutions themselves, quite apart from the academics who work within it, are horribly exploitative.
They have gotten to, I mean, in the U.S., somewhere between 70 and 75% of classes are taught by part-timers. Yeah. And these part-timers often without any benefits, with much lower pay, and generally forced to work multiple campuses, multiple jobs, which means you're teaching a lot of classes and spending a lot of time on the road. It just, it ends up being deeply exploitative. We've moved pretty far away from the old tenured system, and it is honestly a disservice to the students as well, because they get a much worse experience when the academics are not really invested in the campus and spending all their time there. If you finish class and you got to hop in the car and quickly drive to the next campus for your next class, and every hour you're not driving or teaching, you're grading papers, you don't really get to engage in student life much.
And I mean, certainly, like to be clear for anyone who's not familiar with this, part-time in an academic teaching position is not the same thing as part-time outside of that. That does not mean you are working part-time. It just means really you are being paid part-time.
No, I teach 8 classes a semester.
Yeah.
And my full-time counterparts teach 2 to 4. So I'm working more hours by far, but getting much less for it because of the way they structure it.
Yeah, and even getting to your position in the first place is a grueling challenge. I know a few PhD students who are teaching right now during COVID, and just the amount of just sheer time they are forced to endure, reading papers, grading papers, teaching, planning lessons, etc. Like the burnout that must result from that, or that does result from that, is absolutely intense. And now you add on top of that, these people are supposed to, first of all, go through this grueling nightmare labyrinth of getting into a PhD, just getting into the PhD, forget tenure or position. And then after that, after roughly 8 years of toil, now you're supposed to be engaging positively with the outside world. But by the way, you're also doing all of this extra work as a professor, and you've all experienced roughly a decade of burnout. There's no pipeline for experts to, first of all, become experts and then enter politics. The system seems to be geared specifically towards excluding the people who know what they're talking about.
Yeah, it really does. And you invest so much into the whole process, too, that it gets hard to then spend the time on something else and getting out of it, too. Because getting involved in politics, it's a whole different skill set. It's a whole different way of doing a ton of things. And especially in my position where I'm not coming from a tenured spot, you have to continue to balance both of these. And it's just not something that most people have the leisure to do. Burnout is bad enough. I have a lot of people that I went through that abandoned academia. They just couldn't make a living doing it. They found a job in the private sector or ended up teaching high school, or they just continue to slog on year after year. and it gets harder and harder and harder. And as you mentioned, it's difficult enough just to get the PhD.
Yeah.
I mean, we put a lot of time into it, and many of us have to work the whole time we're doing that dissertating as well. So, yeah, it's there's a severe burnout risk from the very beginning of this. Yeah. And to say that more of us, I mean, I want more academics to get involved in politics, but it's hard to make the case to people to do it.
Yeah. It's like never sleep again.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm fortunate, I suppose, in that I don't have kids, because that's at least one less thing to do to take care of it.
Oh God, yeah.
I can't imagine, sustaining 80-hour weeks indefinitely. It does wear on you after a while. I mean, but granted, I worked full time while I was doing the PhD. I was used to putting in a lot of time.
Yeah.
And figured, I can do this for a while.
Yeah. So then comes the big slap in the face, and that is right-wing slander of academia.
Well, yeah. Oh my God, that's such a I'm constantly aghast at this, that universities are like Marxist indoctrination factories or something. And like, are you kidding me? It's like they completely misunderstand the point of tertiary education.
Yeah.
The early levels of education are indoctrination by design. They're teaching you the basic skills you need to function within a given society. That's what they're supposed to do. The purpose of higher education is to break through that indoctrination and create more critical thinkers who can innovate. You're essentially trying to turn out the leaders in different industries. And it does no good to produce, mindlessly indoctrinated leaders.
Yeah.
So I don't even understand what they're thinking. Like, it makes no sense at all.
Well, I actually haven't looked into what degrees specifically the majority of people who go into politics actually end up taking, the ones that do end up getting degrees. But I mean, from my own experience, I find this rather baffling. I live in extremely liberal Western Canada, and I went to university here. And the idea that and I took classes in a variety of departments. I went to philosophy, I went into history, I went into English, I went into religious studies, political science, obviously. And the idea that, first of all, you are being indoctrinated with Marxist ideology is laughable. You will not encounter really anything by Marx, or if you do, it'll be a tiny, tiny smattering, far below what you should be reading, as a matter of fact, given its relevance to current events and to political thought since. But you are more likely to read, in my experience, extracts from Hitler in that period than you are to read anything by Marx, just because it's the first couple of years are geared towards more or less giving you like a kind of like I mean the way the university seems to be structured to me is the first 2 years are largely bent towards people who are not anticipated to actually move on in the field. It's just, here, we'll give you some basics all over the map so you have a rough idea of what the world is like before you start to specialize elsewhere. And unfortunately, that's increasingly gone down the hole, that whole sort of ethos of giving people a general education, and especially with the kind of Fox News denigration of any sort of humanities training as being a dead end. Yeah,
we try, and I really I give a lot of credit to the academics throughout the humanities for pushing back against a lot of that, because what we often focus on in the first couple of years is teaching basic critical thinking skills. I mean, in the survey classes, like the basic lower division history classes, I fully expect those students are going to forget 80% of what I teach them. I mean, I'm not focused on beating certain content into their head so much as the different methodologies, the different critical skills that they'll be able to apply in different areas, as well as a general understanding of the interconnectedness of these different areas. So, and unfortunately, a lot of us do have to focus on basic skills, and people choose different ones. Some focus on writing skills. I focus more on reading and critical analysis skills, but you're basically making up for things that we should get before we even get to college, and we just don't.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because I remember last week I was sort of preparing for this conversation. I was trying to think, okay, so this guy teaches foreign policy on the Middle East generally. I've taken about 10 courses on Middle Eastern politics or history. why can I not remember almost any of the details of these hundreds of hours that I've logged studying this topic? And I sort of realized while I was trying to prepare for this that actually what I gained from those courses ultimately wasn't so much the particular facts and the details, which you lose if you're not using them regularly, but sort of just a general understanding or a general sort of ethic of how you approach a given topic. And that actually has been the most valuable takeaway from it. And to sort of loop around back to where we sort of got off on this tangent, that really is what's missing from the right-wing approach to politics is any sort of ethos of charity or attempting to sort of understand the nuances of the other side or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it seems to me that like there seems to be sort of a vicious circle going on here where there's a simultaneous denigration of the humanities in right-wing circles that lends to them generally entering because these people inherit this from their parents. They go into college. They tend to be very poor students as a result because they are inherently mistrustful of their teachers. And because there's this fomented distrust of academia generally, the academia becomes almost entirely left-wing from their perspective, and thus they distrust academia even more. So,
yeah, I mean, to some extent, it seems that reality can have a little bit of a liberal bias, as they say. But that's more because what we try to do is focus on a more holistic understanding of something. And one of the things people often mistake in looking at the whole left-right divide in worldview is that there are important psychological considerations to take in here, that the right-wing perspectives are ultimately more grounded in fear. And the single biggest target of that fear is difference. It's change. It's the other. So it's going to be a little bit harder to take in those other perspectives that give you a more well-rounded view of the world, because you're immediately running into resistance to it. But this is not to say it doesn't happen. And I've had a lot of solidly right-wing students over the years that still get a great deal out of the classes and end up coming out with exactly a much more rounded view of the world. But there's a kind of knee-jerk resistance to that has to be overcome. And with so much of the right-wing discourse in the media focused on denigrating education as a whole and telling people not to do it and to be distrustful, it makes it that much harder.
Yeah, it's like
people, you're essentially trying to broaden minds or open minds up so that they can think through things on their own and ultimately come up with their own perspectives on things.
Well, that is what a liberal would say, isn't it? But
yeah, but it is kind of what regardless of the political position of people in academia, and I know conservatives, liberals, and leftists in academia, regardless of our individual perspectives, it's what we're all trying to do ultimately.
Yeah. And I mean, like it struck me as sort of tragically hilarious for the longest time. It's like there's this constant complaint about the universities being these sort of left-wing indoctrination centers, and that's evidenced by the fact that there are so many left-wing professors but so few right-wing professors. But at the same time, the people who make this complaint are actually telling their kids, don't go to university. It's a waste of your money. They're just going to indoctrinate you. It's like, go figure. You've told everybody not to go to school. Right. Nobody who agrees with you is going to school.
Right. I mean, there are the people who are more interested in a particular topic or in the minutiae of a particular topic are going to pursue it.
Yeah.
Someone who is reflexively more distrustful of that is, obviously less predisposed to it. It's nothing about the universities themselves that set up some kind of bias. It's just the kind of people who are driven to do this sort of thing in the first place. And it's not like our politics have a huge impact on what we do day to day. They're ultimately irrelevant to most classes.
Which is funny because it occurred to me as you were talking about, you mentioned that a lot of these fears are motivated by a fear of change or the other. And yet it's very curious because the the things against which they will rebel the most strongly, like, for example, climate change, income inequality, or as I should say, measures to address climate change or income inequality. COVID right now, of course. These are things which directly affect them increasingly now, including climate change, which people are for some reason not paying attention to. But even with COVID, it's disproportionately, I would expect, affecting conservatives, largely because they've been the most skeptical of measures to deal with it. And at the same time, the things that they are generally more concerned with are, in fact, the things that are very, very distanced from their everyday lives, the things that they're actually afraid of. SJWs in college, let's say, or same-sex marriage, or trans acceptance, or especially like in any sort of corporate presentation of the aforementioned as being allied with these. Or immigration, often in other countries. So you have people like Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, in Swindon applauding Trump on his proposal to build a wall. And you have conservatives in the United States concerned about immigration allowing Muslims into the United States. Neither of these things are really connected at all, but there's a tremendous amount of no worries. There's a tremendous amount of like the pressure from these super distant things is just absolutely incredible. Meanwhile, these imminent issues are conspiracies or fabrications or something, and otherwise to be entirely ignored.
Yeah, it gets to also the whole question of support for, say, tax cuts for the rich that directly harm our own living standards. And people often say, well, you're voting against your interests. And I think that both the voting against interests, as well as the sense that these ideas are distant from them, in some ways ultimately miss the real point. And this is something that people often struggle to understand too, looking left or right or talking to people, is that either side considers the other to be ultimately immoral. There is a morality involved. It just differs from what a lot of people coming from the left or liberal perspectives might expect the moral answer to be. It's a very different type of morality. But there is a connection between the different issues that obsess them the most, whether it's LGBT issues or abortion issues or taxes or anything else. There is ultimately a moral purpose that they see connecting those different positions, and they don't really see them as distant from their lives. And partly, a lot of the propaganda that you see in the right-wing press feeds that and feeds into those fears and tells them that these are ever-present issues. So, for example, where we see automation taking millions of jobs out of the U.S. manufacturing sector, we technically manufacture more than we ever have, but we do it with far fewer people. And instead, they'll get them thinking, it's immigrants, it's trade with China, it's all these different scapegoat issues, because that's all easier to understand. So you're bombarded with that message over and over again. And meanwhile, you do have the very real fear, what's going to happen to me in my job? What can my kids look forward to? So it is very immediate to them. Whereas immigration does not actually affect people. If we look at kind of more objectively and look at the facts of it, it doesn't. Immigration does not in any way harm the economy. Overall, it produces more jobs. But the fear is still immediate, and the propaganda giving them something to blame just takes them away from what we would kind of like look at.
Yeah, and I mean, I remember myself sort of growing up in that kind of ambience where you'd have like these super emotionally and intense and terrifying presentations to you about I mean, combine this with sort of a Christian fear of any sort of government overreach being associated with the rise of the Antichrist or something along those lines, which is something a lot of people discount, but it's actually really terrifying for a lot of people, especially when you've been brought up in that environment.
Yeah, it becomes a very emotional and very immediate issue for a lot of people.
Oh, massively. The stakes that you've been sort of trained to think are present are immense. But at the same time, like there is a point where, especially with people who become sort of political activists on the right side, and I sort of came out of this milieu at one point. There comes a point where you start to catch on to something that, especially as you talk to more people or you get better educated, that there are more complex things going on here than the ones who the media platforms that sort of indoctrinated you in the first place were sort of letting on. And you usually become quite critical of these over time. But you start to get a little bit cynical. And in terms of morality, I think one of the things that I sort of wrestle with is a lot of the people that you talk to on the other side, and this isn't just right wing, this is left wing as well, but a lot of people, when they get engaged, they recognize the pragmatic value of holding a certain line, and they stop demonstrating the kind of mental flexibility that comes with actually being honest and charitable in conversation. And I think the biggest question for me is, at what point is a person actually lost and ceases to be the kind of person that you want to try and reach out to? That's been a major challenge for me, because like my inclination is I really want to have honest conversations with people and understand their position and be generous and have give and take and learn from each other. But you can't do that if one side is running a grift at the end of the day, just because they're not really there.
Yeah, the conversation it has a very different purpose, and there's something more transactional about it. There's no real effort to listen or learn or grow. And when people, and this is especially something true that you see like in online political discussions, as well as when people can socialize, there's often attempt to win an argument, and that the purpose of argument for them is to advance their position most convincingly. So there's a rhetorical focus there, but it's not actually an attempt to learn or understand. And to me, argument done right is an intellectual process that expands our knowledge. And that's the real purpose there. It's in that give and take. And it's an opportunity to refine your arguments, yes, but also to hear the others and to be able to respond to them. And there's just not enough of that active listening that we see left. I think a good part of it is just the way it's modeled in society, though. We've lost a political class willing to have those conversations, and certainly a political class willing to try and engage the public and elevate political discourse overall. Instead, what we have is a kind of cynical political calculation. This is one of the things I think it's such a waste of time when my side often responds to the propagandistic points pushed out by the right, because you're just falling into a rhetorical trap that takes away time you could be advancing your own arguments. It's just basically trying to run you around. And we waste so much time on things like that. Or people will advance positions solely for cynical political reasons, and then someone will call them a hypocrite and fail to understand that they don't care, that that's not the point. Like the whole question of like the Supreme Court nomination. It's like, well, it's hypocritical. They held the other one up for 10 months and this one they rushed through in a few weeks and blah, blah, blah. And like, why are you bothering to tell them that? They know exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
The purpose was to get the people that they want in the court, and they'll take whatever position mattered to get there. There's simply no regard for hypocrisy on the right. But that, again, there's a common difference in psychology that we fail to bridge, because for more liberal thinkers, hypocrisy actually is important. For more conservative thinkers, it tends not to be. But what we should be talking about really is the issues, and trying to engage each other on the issues and not getting wound up in those differences. And then because then they just become emotional arguments where people dig in their heels and nothing gets done.
Well, I think from the right-wing perspective, we're experiencing sort of a decline of morals. So there's an advantage in some sense, in that they don't need to really sort of push the envelope in terms of like curating the morals of their own side, because ultimately this is already determined what the summum bonum is in politics.
It's a fear of like the overall decline in society, and then that's what obsesses them more. And it is very fundamental to the right-wing or conservative perspective. The sense of decline, I mean, I can give you examples spanning the entire globe over literally thousands of years. It's absolutely fundamental to the conservative way of thinking that somehow things are going in a decline. That's a problem. We're going to collapse. It will never survive. And they fail to understand that societies always do evolve.
Yeah.
These things, we get through them.
Absolutely. And furthermore, the things that's declining, or sorry, I should say, The thing it is declining from was at one point also the product of exactly the same sort of revolution.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the targets of conservative rhetoric change. The specific issues that they care about change, but the mentality ultimately doesn't. There's always a sense that, what's happening right now is an imminent threat to our civilization, and then it just shifts over time.
Yeah. Well, well, exactly. And so from the right-wing perspective, everything that takes place is beyond the line. It's not so much that they're opposed to hypocrisy, it's that they consider themselves to be in a state of sort of civilizational war in which anything goes. Whereas I think the left generally is viewing its interactions with its communities, even globally, as being part of one larger society. And so things like morality and ethics actually do matter. And there's sort of an end goal projected into the future of a better world, not a return to something else, not simply a kind of amputation of stuff that has happened after a certain period in time, but an actual move to improve. And that's one of the reasons why, I mean, there are people who do this cynically as well, but it's one of the reasons for the whole meme of the left eats its own. It's like, well, no, they have a healthy culture of internal criticism and debate.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, self-critique is important, but, and you do see, by contrast, a lot more ideological conformity on the right. But again, these are just part of the nature of how you approach the world. I mean, if you're teaching people to be more open-minded and more willing to engage with different ideas, then you're going to have more internal debate. If you're telling people it's bad to be looking at all these other ideas and all these like foreign concepts or whatever, then of course there's going to be a bit more conformity in what becomes normal. But it still is held with a great deal of emotional commitment. And these are very deep fundamental issues for a lot of people. And when we basically approach each other saying, well, you're dumb, you're stupid, whatever, you're wrong, people dig their heels in and nothing actually gets done. I think that it's possible to have very productive dialogue across perspectives if you're willing to try and understand where someone's coming from in the first place, and then frame your arguments in a way that takes seriously whatever is bothering them, whatever particular fear that they have.
Now, what do you do, though, in a situation where you have increasingly the culture of the right generally, which is condensing into increasingly, unfortunately, into a more or less coherent thing? Not quite yet, but we're seeing that. It is homogenizing very much. Certainly more so in the past 10 years than, I mean, any time in my lifetime, to be sure. But what do you do then when one side is simply trying to beat the other in that way, when one side is almost categorically being conditioned to approach a conversation with an attitude to undermining the other side and not so much any sort of collaborative mutual learning, like what do you do in that case?
I think the way to do it is to hit back in a way that someone is actually going to be able to understand or respect, even if they disagree with you on different points. And I think that requires a greater degree of honesty than a lot of politicians are willing to engage in. You do have to be willing to really push forward your own ideas and be willing to have those conversations where you try to frame them for people, and simply through the persistence, through patience, through engaging honestly and consistently with people, you'll see a lot of respect develop. I think this is one of the reasons you see so many conservatives and Republicans actually genuinely respect Bernie Sanders. Even if they might disagree with a lot of his ideas, they treat him as a human being because he is consistent and because he focuses on his issues instead of going around and just playing political games. And I think that there's a lesson to be drawn from that matters for the left as a whole. And this is one of the reasons you mentioned a growing kind of conformity on the right, or sort of coalescing in a particular direction. It just so happens that direction is neo-fascistic. And there are severe dangers for democracies all around the world because of the rise of that kind of right populist or authoritarian rhetoric. And it is simply a fact that historically, liberals and certainly neoliberals do a terrible job of combating that sort of politics because they don't really understand it. But left-wing movements can, and leftist movements can. And the same sort of people, too. This is something that we also really forget a lot in the US. You know, the fact that someone may be socially more conservative or more isolated from a more homogenous community does not stop them from embracing different types of politics and certainly different socioeconomic views. Left populists used to do extremely well in farm country in the US. In fact, there were literal socialist movements that did really well in places like Oklahoma and Kansas that today people just write off as like super right wing. If you put things in a way that people understand and that they can relate to their own lives, if you're willing to engage with them, then you can actually win those arguments. If your goal is to play a kind of partisan game and push back and forth for advantage without genuinely offering an alternative to people and without a real sense of authenticity or honesty, it's going to fail. They're going to be able to stereotype you, you're this, that, the other thing, and shut you out. It's a lot harder to shut somebody out if they're persistently trying to reach you.
In terms of playing that political game, though, I mean, especially with the way the universities have gone in terms of decreasing opportunities for students to actually have a viable career in academia or as a serious intellectual generally in any sort of profession. I think a large part of the rights, or I should say, I think a large part of the inability of the left to engage positively people on the right has been because of the kind of blindsiding of the left generally as sort of new media sort of started to sort of initially proliferate, where you had all of these undergraduate students and sort of little people suddenly having a massive amount of reach and a massive amount of success by sort of playing off the other side and hitting back with exactly the same tactics. Because that, and I think a lot of
emotional tactics work. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't interpret, like, even strongly left-wing academics don't generally approve that sort of activity. I think what happened though was people who had more or less given up on like the straight and narrow track to doing it right saw an opportunity in this, and people on the left generally didn't know how to respond to this, because you suddenly have these massive followings that are being very harsh and very well, like the whole idea of sort of like the SJW thought police. It's like that's not really how academics are at all. That's how a small vocal minority who knew how to manipulate social media made it seem, and that spooked people on both sides. Yeah, so I mean, to a certain extent, what's happened with new media is the public sphere has become just absolutely diluted to the point where it almost doesn't exist anymore. And this actually kind of brings me to wanting to ask you about money in politics, because what's happened is, because people can sort of buy a voice or magnify their voices with money alone. Where the actual debates take place is almost entirely dictated by where people have allocated funds, and this can be done entirely artificially.
Yep.
So I don't know, what do we do? Because at this point, it's the actual academics are basically muzzled and are being misrepresented from one side and the other. So, like, yeah.
I think one of the bigger problems you run into, and you do mention just how diverse and diffuse the media sphere is gotten, and that does, in a way, eliminate some of the traditional public sphere. It's being more consolidated, at least in its corporate sense, seemed at one point to give it stronger influence over the parties. But that actually feeds into a neo-fascist backlash, which then can teach a kind of distrust in the media as well as in our other institutions. And that's where a lot of the real danger lies. But honestly, Democrats are in large part responsible for much of that too, because they were complicit in deregulation of corporations and the media that allowed that kind of massive consolidation in the first place, which gave a tremendous amount of homogeneity in the typical media and the kinds of things that you're going to see in major newspapers, for example, or on network television. A lot of that is just the same kind of nonsense, and it doesn't have the same obligations to be honest anymore because of things that happened under Reagan's and Clinton's administration that freed them from the responsibility to be more honest about these things. And that's a real problem. And I think it's been very difficult to push back against the new media that show up there, because a lot of that new media focuses on building a sense of outrage. It's intensely emotional, so it sucks you in a way that a lot of traditional media wouldn't. And this, of course, has fed an increasing shift in major media to become much more sensationalistic as well. Cable news in the United States is essentially garbage, whether you're talking about Fox or MSNBC. Its job isn't really to inform anymore. And one of the single biggest problems that we face, I think, is that the major media's owners in the corporate class do not see as big a threat to their bottom line in a drift toward neo-fascism as they do in a genuinely revitalized left, which will push for more regulation and for breaking up these giant monopolies. So they're going to, in a sense, acquiesce to a lot more of those perspectives and ignore more of the real issues because it ultimately doesn't matter much. I mean, look at how much free airtime Trump was given. The danger that Trump posed to our democracy was secondary to the profits that could be made by exciting people's emotions and putting him on the air. I mean, ultimately, it didn't even matter, I think, to a lot of people whether he lost in 2020 or not, because they would continue to make money regardless. And if Trump won again, I mean, the conservative elements in the Democratic Party could continue to fundraise off of Trump and the media can continue to make money off of Trump and all the attention there. And that whole money machine we keep grinding on, instead of actually, I don't know, from my perspective, looking at this as an academic, like, we need to do something about this as a real problem. That's harder to do. And in new media, the left has had a harder time getting its message to get out of the smaller spaces that we're in. Whereas a lot of the bellicose rhetoric that originates in far right new media slowly creeps in to the mainstream major media. The reverse is not as true.
You know, I want to push back on something. It's not clear to me that it was Trump's airtime that contributed to his successful bid for the presidency. It seems to me he's actually not the opposite necessarily, but I don't know. When you went onto CNN.com while the election was taking place or leading up to it, you would see top to bottom just endless, the most petty things possible concerning Trump's eating habits, his physique, his sort of sleazy sexual history, things like that. Stuff that people didn't really care about, but which gave the impression of, especially because this was sort of proliferate across media platforms for the reasons that you just articulated, it gave the impression of a massive conspiracy against the man himself. I think, like, he seems to have suffered the most when he's simply allowed to speak.
Right. Well, honestly, both of those play into his hands. In 2015 and 2016, a lot of the major media, the cable news and whatnot, would just tune into his rallies and play his rallies straight through. And people would get to see, exactly what he's saying. So it gave him a tremendous amount of free advertising to build a movement in the first place. And then having a lot of the big corporate media turn against him and seeing the constant petty attacks, that feeds into the grievance culture that already exists on the right, which then further builds a tight connection to him. So it strengthens the movement that he was trying to build overall. It doesn't matter ultimately which way they went. If they were going to engage in these either petty attacks or give him free airtime, both of them are actively harmful. What we used to do a lot more in American media, and this is something that's still relatively common in the rest of the rich world, is on the news present a more balanced perspective and actually have people fact checking you. So actually that statement is false. That's clearly false. And there's a greater sense of trust long term in the media. What we've seen over the last few decades is a great deal of erosion of Americans' faith in the media as well as in our institutions. It's one of the things that contributes to our fall in rankings of democracies around the world. People just they don't trust what they see anymore, and to some extent that's warranted.
I would say to a tremendous extent that's warranted. The problem is that it doesn't seem to breed a healthy skepticism in the media so much as it breeds absolute credulity in the statements and the proclamations of alternative media.
Exactly. Yeah. It doesn't actually build the kind of critical thinking that I try to teach my students to read the media, like to see, look for the biases, see who's funding a particular idea, like what perspective might be coming through here, teaching people to read between the lines. Yeah. That's healthy. But teaching people to just tune out anything that doesn't already agree with them, which is essentially what's happening there on the right, it breeds a kind of dependence on an alternative media sphere that has no standards of journalistic integrity at all. Where, I mean, major media, they've already fallen substantially, but it's nothing like what you're going to see cranked out in far-right media sources.
So given that the media largely contributed to Trump's successful bid for the presidency, and given that the Democrats played along with this almost to a T, are they similarly, in your opinion, just not invested in winning, or are they simply incompetent and don't know what they're doing?
It's a little of both, and I think it depends on the person. Some of it is that if it takes doing a certain thing to win, I think there are people who would choose not to, because it just wouldn't be profitable to win. But some of it, I think, honestly, is a kind of sincere blindness to what's happening. And this is the same kind of thing that you can see when you're facing these kind of movements. I mean, liberals did terribly against fascist movements everywhere they happened. The kinds of basic assumptions made about fair play and whatnot just don't pan out when your opponent is thinking strategically against you and will do anything it takes to win. It's just a poor approach. If you need to face off against a right populist movement, you need a left populist movement. You need a stronger politics of the left. And we just don't have that in the US. In basic policy terms, in basic policy orientation, there's honestly not a huge amount that separates Trump and Biden. The differences are more in the aesthetics and in their, I guess, in some of their social concerns or considerations. What kinds of things that they'll talk about, the things that they'll consider to be important. Obviously, Biden cares a lot more about basic human rights in the US than Trump does. But there's not as much daylight between their politics as we might want. And that's been true for decades now. All of our presidents of both parties have been in the same authoritarian right section. There's not as much difference between Clinton and Obama on the one hand and Reagan on the other as people might want to think. And that similarity in that they both essentially serve the same corporate class makes it a lot harder to articulate a good counter vision to what the right offers. Because the core ideologies are so similar, it's hard to offer a compelling alternative that really answers people's questions, especially if you're not talking about the same fears. And again, there are actually legitimate fears motivating a lot of what's happening on the right. It's just that the analysis of them is completely wrong, right? What they're being told will fix it is just going to make it worse. But there are real fears underlying a lot of that. And if you can kind of get to the core of it and offer an alternative vision, you could turn things around.
Yeah, and the difference does seem to pivot sort of around this kind of, I guess you could say, the liberal conception of an ideal politics as being one that is simply static. You have people on the right who, by and large, broadly seem to want to work within a system to sort of brute force norms in that the system is not organically produced. And you have people not necessarily, like, I mean, this is of course overly general, but you have a lot of people on the left, and the left is largely perceived in this vein from people on the right and from the center, as being interested in a sort of either a restructuring or a reformation of society at a much deeper scale. And insofar as sort of liberals and centrists or what have you, sort of fence sitters, people aren't really deep into either of these two extremes, are concerned. They look at this and they see one side wants to fundamentally, in some respect, at least from their perspective, to dissolve the thing that they have that they know gives them some modicum of stability, whereas the other side bills itself as, I mean, while they are in effect doing the same thing, they bill themselves as, no, actually, we want to sort of wind back the clock on the dissolution that's already taken place. And I don't know, it seems to me that despite these similarities in policies, really just the aesthetic of in any way appealing even to people who can be even remotely described as being on the left side of that sort of model, that's really what fuels kind of the liberal to right pipeline. That was kind of meandering. I'm not even sure if that made sense.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure, but I'll throw a few things out here and we'll see what we can do. So there's one thing that stands out to me a lot in American politics, and you guys have a lot less, I think, of this problem in Canada and in Europe than we have here, but I've seen some signs of it as well. People honestly have no idea what words like liberal or conservative mean anymore. We've completely lost touch with them. And a lot of people who self-identify as conservative in the US are anything but. And one of the key things that people forget about fascist thought or neo-fascist thought is that it's neither liberal nor conservative. It's anti-liberal and anti-conservative. It is actually talking about a kind of radical rebirth, a kind of rejuvenation or restoration of the nation. And I see a lot of people today talking in the same way that you saw, in the 20s, 30s, 40s about degeneracy in society. Yeah. And they really do want fundamental change. And it does make it a bit more radical. And again, if you have a radical ideological commitment on one side, then talking about preservation of the status quo and maintaining a certain stability like in the markets or this or that, which is basically how we can describe the Clinton and Obama administrations, there's no ability to push back. So what you have is, in our overall socioeconomics, a steady decline under right-wing leadership, Republican leadership, and then a kind of plateauing under Democrats, and then further decline. And all the while, all the things that the right is destroying and undermining further the radicalization of their own base. And that's kind of the point. It's one of the reasons that they practice a lot of regulatory capture when they get in. They put incompetent people in charge deliberately to destroy the engines of government so they can say, look, see, government is bad, but trust me, I'll fix things. And it feeds into a kind of reactionary fear-based authoritarianism. It's been, Trump was predictable. Absolutely. And I've been saying for a long time that we'll get something worse there. And defeating Trump was never the point of these elections. And I keep trying to warn people that getting Trump out of office doesn't fix anything, because if we continue with this sort of status quo politics, we make something worse than Trump inevitable. Just as we've gone from Reagan to W to Trump. I mean, it's going to keep getting worse.
Well, imagine if Trump didn't have the inadequacy of his ability to respond to COVID, for example, on full display throughout the entire pandemic.
Exactly. I mean, he really could have won. And honestly, I mean, I called this election a toss-up in the same way I called 2016. He always could have won. And the fact that he is going to maintain that fervent support, that's the real issue we have to tackle. And when people are trying to address it in the sense that they're basically talking down to that audience, we have to somehow educate these dumb yokels or whatever, you're missing the point. I mean, if you don't address the key issues that made Trumpism viable, you're not going to be able to pull people away from it. If you address the core issues, then you can slowly pull people's attachment away from those issues. But as long as nothing changes for them in the things that most worried them in the first place, there's no way to reach them.
Yeah, and I mean, like I mean, COVID is obviously the thing, at least to me, what brought Trump down. Before then, I almost would have said Trump is likely to win by a slim margin, just because Biden was such an incredibly weak candidate, and because so much has been successfully in the minds of his voters been imputed of his failures been imputed to resistance from the left. Fictional, of course, but that's how it's been presented and quite widely. It would have been so easy for him to step back early on when this pandemic started, say, this is out of my league. I'm deferring to the experts on this. Don't worry, we're going to take care of you. Never say or do anything about COVID again, have the same amount of death, and he could have won still. Like it's that to me is just absolutely terrifying. And
especially when you've got a significant chunk of his base insisting that this was never really a problem in the first place, and we'd be better off having completely ignored it. I mean, and a lot of it, they're being deliberately fed misinformation. All this discussion of like herd immunities or whatever. I mean, if we counted on the development of natural herd immunity, okay, this would play out over several years and 1 million people would die. Is it really what you want? I mean, when we can do better? I mean, it was entirely possible to prevent most of these deaths and take care of the economy. And there's a massive failure to address that.
You know what I've never seen, and this, now that you mentioned it, it's kind of interests me. So the number of dead from COVID, let me actually pull the numbers up here. I'm kind of curious about this. Okay, so how many dead are we looking at as of right now? It's just under 300,000, isn't it?
In the U.S.
In the U.S., yeah.
It's close to 260, I think. Last I saw, it was like 257, something like that. It creeps up pretty fast, and it's picking up faster right now. We actually just broke another record in California for hospitalizations. December is going to be pretty bloody.
So this is what kind of fascinates me. Oh God, yeah, that Christmas is going to be horrifying.
Oh, yeah. I mean, especially, we're going to have tons of the delayed effects from people out in big crowds all the way up to November because of the election, and then with the Thanksgiving and all the travel around that, meeting families. Yeah,
Before I get on to my question, because this actually just occurred to me. It's really interesting, but before I get on to that, another thing that's been really worrying me, the long-term effects of COVID, they seem to be of a sort that would, especially in younger people, severely hinder their ability to succeed in a career or in school or what have you. It seems to have the result of making people extraordinarily tired, or to have almost symptoms of like it almost sounds like MS symptoms, a lot of the people who survive it, as well as like catastrophic blood clots, things like that.
Yeah, what I'm worried about is, and they've already seen some signs of this, a significant chunk of people who are younger who do have this end up developing permanent lung damage out of it. I mean, we're going to cause tons of long-term issues from this. That we're going to be dealing with the ramifications of COVID for many, many years.
This is what I'm really worried about. What happens when you have massive swaths of the labor and working class with these debilitating in 5-10 years from now? Like that's...
I mean, if it were really allowed to completely ravage the population, if we did nothing at all about this, I mean, yeah, the consequences of that would be horrific. And we've seen plenty of things like this before too, where big epidemic diseases do tear down economies just because of the long-term consequences of dealing with it. In the same way that wars can. The number of people that come back injured and hurt from them have a significant impact on the overall economy.
Yeah.
One of the things that drives me nuts about the responses to this is that we could have actually supported the overall economy and prevented any kind of real consequences from this if we had put in place good policies from the beginning and ponied up the cash needed for it. But continuing to just do the bare minimum or play it safe gives you the worst of both worlds. You don't stop enough of the deaths and you damage the economy.
Well, I'll never not find this the most grimly hilarious thing of 2019, or 2020, I should say, is that Trudeau was able to close flights into Canada immensely faster than build the wall Trump could. The one time he had a blank check, stop travel into the country, and he just couldn't do it. But
Right.
what I wanted to talk about,
They did it wrong because and a lot of people on the right continue to point out that Trump did
Yeah.
try to close down flights from China,
okay,
but
That
they
doesn't-
did it. But they did it wrong, you know.
Yeah.
And they say, "Oh, the Democrats didn't let him do it. They complained that it was racist or this or that. Trump would have saved us." But it wasn't really what was needed. It wasn't really an attempt to stop the travel and then quarantine or test people.
Yeah.
They just wanted to shut it down completely, and
Yeah.
it was kind of in the same way that they've shut down so much of the asylum process or whatever, in a way that only plays to that kind of anti-immigration fear, but wouldn't actually have addressed the issue. And we already had cases in the U.S. before they even brought up trying to stop those flights, so it never would have worked anyway. But it is
for sure.
Our administration's response has been fundamentally incompetent.
Yeah. What I was going to bring up is you'll often hear, especially like there's a sort of a weird combination of responses to COVID from the right that I've seen. One is that it's just a flu, it doesn't particularly matter, and the other is that it only kills 1% of people. And I mean they're compatible with each other. You can say, oh, it's just a flu or what have you. It only kills 1% of people at the same time. But here's what kind of confuses me. The same side that is hyper concerned about immigration regards the deaths from COVID to be negligible.
Mm-hmm.
The numbers of immigrants brought in through the refugee program, if I'm reading this correctly, was 45,000 in 2018. So you compare that to the number of people who have died from this disease, which is apparently of negligible importance. Like, how do you sustain that? Is it just general ignorance of the actual numbers of immigrants, or what is it?
No, and that's where when people come at this and they try to correct the facts, they're kind of missing the point, because it's always the emotional issue. This is one of the reasons that on the right it still really, really works to focus on anybody who suffered a crime at the hands of like an undocumented immigrant. And that's somehow a huge issue. And we completely ignore the fact that the undocumented migrants actually lower the U.S. crime rate overall because they are less likely to commit crimes than the native born. But it's an emotional issue because you can say, well, they shouldn't have been here at all, so that crime was preventable.
Right.
And it plays to a strong commitment. They already have an emotional commitment to something that they have. Whereas the issues of a disease, it's a lot more complex. It doesn't really fit into a nice, neat narrative that they already had. And it's easy to rationalize away those deaths, especially when right-wing media, and particularly right-wing small media, has been feeding all these crazy conspiracies. Even if it was only 1%, you're talking about a massive death toll in a country this large. If it was completely uncontrolled, if they never imposed any restrictions, if people didn't wear any masks at all and nothing shut down ever, and 1% of the population died, I mean, over the course of a couple of years, 2/3 of the U.S. population could have been infected. That's a couple million dead. And just they don't even think about that. It's just too abstract. It doesn't really fit neatly into an existing narrative, whereas there's been a tremendous amount of conditioning on the right to focus on freedoms, which is kind of ironic since the right has done the most to undermine individual freedoms in the U.S., but whatever. They're told that our freedoms matter, and this is an imposition on freedoms. And I think the left has utterly failed to neuter that argument. And to me, it's astonishing because, I don't know, are they out there protesting stoplights? Like we should never stop at a red light again, because it's the same kind of thing about saying wear masks.
I don't know. Did you see that libertarian? Did you see the libertarian presidential debates?
Yeah, and there's all the jokes of showing pictures of like snarled traffic and whatever. Like, oh, this is the libertarian paradise. But most people in the U.S. would not be out there protesting very simple things like speed limits. But the purpose of a speed limit is to protect the lives of other people, and that's what masks were for. And we never managed effectively to neuter those arguments. And I think part of it is because so much groundwork was laid that it helps a certain thing work. And if you just approach it empirically, if you just try to contradict the facts, that doesn't have the same impact. It doesn't help. One of the things that I try to do, and that I'm always arguing people should do more in politics, is try to frame your policies in a way that makes sense to your audience. Like, take into account their arguments, which is one of the reasons that when I talk about universal health care, I talk about how it will lower our cost of living, effectively being a tax cut, and it will increase our freedom because we'll be able to see any doctor we want and not think about being stuck in particular networks. Because freedom and taxes are two really big emotional commitments a lot of people on the right already have. And people on the left already understand the value of like saving lives. So you're preaching to the choir there if you just focus on the moral arguments for universal health care. We need to try and like put things into a particular framework that the audience we want to reach will understand.
So how do we deal with, as largely a result of this sort of false freedom discourse from the right, the response from a lot of people on the left to an unfortunately powerful and loud degree has been not to critique the misframing of the way in which they're discussing things like freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, instead, it's been to mock these. So there's like, some will say free speech, they'll respond freeze peach or something like this is doing something.
Right. And there's a kind of I don't know, I guess for some people there's a kind of emotional catharsis in blowing. Did that just did I cut out at all?
I can still hear you.
Okay, good. Is the picture back up or?
Oh yeah, no, you seem to be perfectly.
Yeah, it like seemed to freeze for a second.
We're flickering a bit here. That might be related to that. So if we suddenly go black, that's what happened.
No worries. Yeah, there's a kind of emotional release that you get in a lot of that pushback, but it's ultimately harmful. And that's hard too, because it's hard to tell people, oh, you can't do that or mock that or this or that, because, people need that, but it doesn't help in the debate at all. And it contributes to this whole talking past each other that we have. There's no real interest, it seems, almost in trying to win the arguments. And you mentioned that it is difficult when you see that somebody does not seem willing to engage honestly. How can you even take their position seriously or talk to them? I mean, the simple answer is we're forced to, and then we have to find techniques to do it, because if we don't, things get more and more polarized, and you set the stage for authoritarian minority rule. I mean, at some point you will be completely unable to reach people. They would be completely committed to overturning all of our existing institutions, and you're just sort of screwed. There's no way to deal with that. We have to somehow find a way to reach people before that. And I think one of the key issues there is we need to convince enough people more on the left or liberal side to focus on the right policies we need to start fixing some of the core issues. If we can start addressing some of the core concerns that the right can play on, that it can manipulate, manipulate the fears. I mean, if we were really to solve the healthcare issue or the immigration issue or address crime in the U.S., then it would be a lot harder for the right to use those to rile people up. And then you could peel away that middle segment of them, the swing voter types, on the basis of your own arguments. But until we address those core issues, it's going to get harder and harder to do that.
And no doubt,
Biden administration is that we're not going to try and tackle all of the key issues.
Yeah. I don't want to take we'll start to wrap up soon, because I know I've had you for an hour and you've got some other things ahead of you today. But just quickly before we go into audience questions, by the way, I didn't mention this at all, but if anybody has questions, please put an asterisk next to them if you're not super chatting. And if you, and then we'll get to questions at some point, time permitting. But no doubt, Professor, you've experienced pushback against sort of calls to adopt this more pragmatic view as to how to address these things. So I suppose my question is, do you have any advice for people when you're dealing with people who are resistant to doing things that are pragmatically going to have a good result, when a lot of people, especially on the left, unfortunately, are in it for the catharsis and not to actually make things better, like that whole free speech thing, that's not born of like, I think this is going to be a great way to beat this misuse of free speech discourse by the right and what have you. It's like, no, they're doing that because they're just outright mocking the people they're discussing with. How do you deal with people who are sort of resistant to any kind of pragmatic approach to politics, basically on those grounds?
Yeah, I think it gets back in a way to one of the first things you asked about academics getting involved in politics at all, because it's asking a lot of people to be patient enough to have those conversations and not to respond sort of derisively to some of these crazy ideas, especially given how unhinged and fact-free a lot of the rhetoric is on the right. But the problem here is that rhetoric is actually working. And the fact that it's working highlights some really serious social problems that we have to get at. Just responding derisively isn't going to help in the long run to solve those issues. For me, the practical politics does involve pushing for much stronger policies on the left. And it does involve a lot of self-examination within the Democratic Party, because the more it takes these right-wing, what it considers to be the middle-of-the-road pragmatic positions, the worse things are going to get. Basically acceding to demands from the right and trying to meet them halfway is actually setting up the grounds for this neo-fascist politics. We have to drag things back more toward a real center. It's one of the things that drives me nuts about the way people deal with people like Bernie Sanders. Sanders is a centrist. I mean, he's literally where the FDR Democratic Party used to be. Like between FDR and Johnson, the basic New Deal consensus, that's where Bernie is. He's not a flaming lefty. If we can't get politics at least back toward that middle, and in a way that addresses the declining living standards of ordinary people. I mean, we're down to 17th in the world in quality of life. We're down to 27th in the world in social mobility. Poverty. We have extreme poverty in the U.S. comparable to like the occupied West Bank or Albania. It's ridiculous. I mean, there's higher levels of poverty in Mexico. Lower levels of poverty in Mexico. There are more people in extreme poverty in Mexico than in the U.S. I mean, like, I don't know. We've kind of flipped things around, where the U.S. is in many ways, I think I still missaid that. Well, whatever. You guys get the point. I mean, we're basically, in many ways in the U.S., more comparable to the developing world than to the rich world at this point. And there are real consequences to that. And the fears about that decline can be spun into the scapegoating that the right thrives on. So if we can't get Democrats to really tackle the core economic issues and get back to a much more progressive framing, we're in real trouble.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know. It seems like a lot of people in the United States want to treat their state as if it's not a state. They just want it to be a post office or something. Like but I mean, like, really, like you have this immense, especially with respect to military spending, you have this immense outward focused expenditure, and they leave their own people to die.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean,
what we seem to forget is that on its own, the business class is going to screw everything up because they're going to be short-sighted, focused on shareholder profit because that's their job. And on their own, states are also similarly corrupt. If community economies don't work out terribly well, regardless of whatever ideals you might have, because of the insular nature of them. That's not going to work either. But somewhere in between, where you have effective regulation that does pay attention to the needs of the whole, that does have more of an ideological consideration with protecting the people, working in concert with it can actually produce decent results. And we end up with these weird extremes that try to like shut that out, that try to like pretend that isn't the case. And a lot of Americans, after decades of propaganda telling them that government is entirely the problem, they've forgotten that some things do work out better that way. The healthcare is a key one there. It was one of the points I try to make about the Medicare for All system and removing the private insurers from it. It's not about a government takeover, because that's what the right's always calling a government takeover of healthcare. What in essence it would do is create a thriving free market in providers by taking the insurance aspect out of it. And it would make things massively more efficient because you wouldn't have to have a massive bloated administration, dealing with all these different plans, trying to figure out what's covered and what's not covered. I mean, administrative costs for hospitals have gone through the roof. since we created all this for-profit healthcare from the 70s on. It's just insane. At the same time, people are limited. They're locked into particular networks, so you don't have all the competition among the providers, and you don't have the competition that would actually lower prices. And it's at the end of the day, it's a simple actuarial issue. The more people you have in the same, what they call risk pool, the lower the overall costs. If you break into different private insurers, they're by definition smaller risk pools. Some things the private sector can do more efficiently. Some things governments can do more efficiently. Insurance is one of those. It was one of the latter. And it's very difficult to break through and get that argument across when people have spent so much time basically saying that government is always more inefficient and always worse than the private sector. And that's simply not the case. Medicare works more efficiently than any one of our private insurers do. It costs less per person to provide better care.
Well, I have some experience with sort of the costs incurred from having a family member with a cancer diagnosis. When my father had terminal cancer, he had to be in the hospital for an extended amount of time. He was in and out for more or less a year. If he had been in the United States uninsured, he would have accrued a horrendous debt as a result that would have fallen onto his family. We ended up spending nothing. And I mean, there are disadvantages to our healthcare system. For example, as a result of just the limited funding for family doctors and things like that, we are exceptionally bad at detecting systemic illnesses until it's very far down the line. Right. But we don't, for example, have people coming out of the hospital with a COVID diagnosis with $1 million, not a bill, but a bill, a medical bill.
From what I've seen, a lot of the issues in the Canadian system are actually similar to issues that people have when they complain about the VA hospitals in the U.S., the Veterans Administration ones. And it's more a simple lack of funding. Yeah. You pay a lot less per capita than we did. If we rolled out a better system that still saved us money, that still had us paying less per capita, but paid in more per capita than you, there's no way to have those problems. It's how much is going to be available to the different providers and hospitals.
Yeah, and I mean it's really frustrating to see that you have so many people on the right who are simultaneously sort of decrying the decline of things like culture and whatnot in the United States, when simultaneously they're opposing vehemently any sort of policy that would give people sort of the leisure and health to develop culture. You have especially people in the labor class being reduced to virtual slavery. And
we're 35th in the world in terms of overall health. And as much as they want to just say that's all due to our diet, and granted, plenty of it is. I mean, the American diet is horrific and we keep exporting it to the world. But it's not the reason for being in 35th place, especially given that we spend twice as much per capita as any other rich country on healthcare. We're misspending that money, and we're not putting it where it needs to be in taking care of people.
Sure. Well, even with diet, though, that's not a choice. If you're working like 60 hours a week, and that's generally what's expected from what I've read, like you're not going to have time to cook for yourself. If you're working out in a warehouse somewhere, you're not going to have time typically after work to go to a grocery store. You're going to buy fast food.
Exactly. That feeds into both the fast food issue there, the lack of time that we have, and all the little convenience, little microwavable type foods. Yeah. But there's also the simple fact that since wages have not really, if you adjust for inflation, wages haven't gone up in the U.S. in 40 years. And processed foods are generally far cheaper than fresh, healthy foods are. And that's a problem too. And on the right, what you have is people saying, look, all these poor people are overweight, so clearly they have enough food. No, they're overweight because what they're eating is not nutritious.
It's sugar. It's sugar and fat, yeah.
It's all the sugars and fats that they pack into the processed foods. So these are just tons of ripple out health consequences of not paying people enough, of artificially keeping our wages too low.
Not to mention, you spend as many hours working as the people do in the United States at the wages that they're earning, and you deal with that horrible, crushing, that bleak outlook on your future, and you have all this addictive food around you. That's
anxiety, and exactly.
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
I can have some ice cream, and that'll make me feel better. No, it doesn't really solve the problem, but you kind of get why people do it. And it's one of the reasons, too, that so many people turn to different drugs or alcohol or whatever. They're basically releases from a needlessly stressful lifestyle. And these are all, at the end of the day, policy choices. And the right loves to talk about personal responsibility and bootstraps and all this. And they forget that policy does matter, that it does affect the opportunities that are available to people. And if you can, at the end of the day, get people to understand that higher wages for them would help to solve a lot of the problems that bother them, a lot of the things that they seem to care about, and show them, look, if this and this and this are the things that you care about, then this, and this would solve those problems. Then you're, in a sense, taking seriously their concerns without wasting the time debating the solutions that they're being fed on the right. And that's what people often do on my side of the aisle is they waste time trying to contradict the arguments, and they spend less time articulating their own policies and how they would address the concerns of the voters.
I think the biggest and the tragic irony for me is, I mean, there is actually like something tremendously healthy about this whole take responsibility for yourself discourse and whatnot. Like this is a thing that people should embrace, not necessarily argue against. It's sad that it only goes in one direction. It seems for the right, where individuals who they choose to marry, what they do for work, the decisions they make in terms of diet or what have you, or anything of this sort. This has to be done with a mind to the good of the country, but at no level is the country actually responsible back for the people themselves. They're happy to cast them to the wind and just trust in fate. It's kind of, I don't know, but
it's ultimately self-defeating. But simply pointing that out doesn't really help. We have to find a way to reach people where they are, in essence. And I think that, in essence, subverting some of that rhetoric would be helpful if we took seriously the concerns that are being fed to them and showed how this policy will help people to take more personal responsibility and will help with the bootstraps issue. I mean, the fact that the U.S. is down to 27th in social mobility, that should tell you very clearly the bootstraps aren't working as well as they used to. When the old, hidebound classist societies of Western Europe are today, you have a much better chance of pulling yourself out of poverty. There are systemic factors. It's not that the Americans somehow, I don't know, we all just turned lazy and you just gave up. It's the deck is more and more stacked against you. So if you can show people, no, what I want is for people to be able to succeed on their own. I want greater opportunity to succeed, not handouts or free stuff. You're basically helping them to see the benefits of what you're offering by using language that they're already familiar with.
Yeah, I would absolutely deny that anyone living today is lazier than anyone living in the past.
No,
I think people today are working extraordinarily more.
Like, millennials aren't entitled people who want to live in their parents' basements and play video games. They're stuck living in their parents' basements or whatever because the rent is too damn high and the pay is too low. They're being screwed.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, how at that point can you blame them for wanting to check out if they do? It's like you've given them a horrible deal.
Exactly. We need to take some responsibility for that.
Yeah. All right, I've kept you for like an hour and 20 minutes. Do you feel like you want to go for questions or?
Yeah. Let's hit some of the questions you've got, going along there.
Sure. Do you mind if we take like a 5-minute break? I've been drinking a tremendous amount of coffee throughout this, so I'll be right back.
I'll actually open the door. My dog's been begging to go outside, so I'll let her wander out.
All right, brilliant. So yeah, anybody in the audience, if you want to ask a question, put an asterisk next to it, so when I scroll down, I can pick them out pretty easily. And only questions at this point. If you guys could, that'd make it a million times easier. All right, we'll be back in 5. All right, I'm back, and we are just waiting for Professor O'Mara. So please ask your questions and mark them with an asterisk so I can find them when I'm scrolling through. That would be fantastic. And we should be starting to go in about 2 or so minutes. So. All right, let's see. Welcome back. All right. So again, we're going to start questions now. So if anybody has a question, put an asterisk next to it so I can identify it as I'm scrolling through. I'm going to handpick a few of these because it'll take us all day otherwise. So I'll pick some that seem interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So this one's kind of a strangely worded one, but it could yield some interesting answers. So Sean Croft asks, what is the best method of sustaining the closest possible unity between theory and praxis, or Giddens structuration? I have no idea what that means. Structure plus agency approaches if non-Marxian phrasing would help. I don't know how you want to interpret that question.
I lost you at the last part.
Yeah.
So I got trying to bring together a theory and practices, but what was on the last part?
The last part is strange to me. He seems to offer an alternative way of phrasing the question, which is or Giddens, Giddens, structuration, which is structure plus agency approaches if non-Marxian. So we'll work with the first half of that question. What is the best method?
Just Anthony Giddens. I'm assuming that he means there. Okay. Let's see. Honestly, for me, one of the key issues, I guess, has to come down to a kind of, I don't know, I hate to reduce it this much, but a sense of authenticity and a focus on the positive effects. We can often get too wrapped up in compelling theories and not spend enough time really talking to people. I think that's one of the things that was a bit distinctive about me politically for people in this area is that I have an entirely working class background. I didn't even start college until I was 30. I'm the first person in my family with a degree. And I still think of myself as a working person. I don't have a kind of a cloistered ivory tower, bourgeois, middle class sort of orientation. And I'd rather hang out in the pub talking to somebody about the issues than hanging out with fellow eggheads and just like debating airy theories. I think if we can ground our ideas a bit more in the concerns of ordinary people, and I think that the thing that matters the most there is just being willing to listen and talk to people, to just engage authentically with people and hear their concerns, then it gives us an opportunity to try and apply theory directly to make it real for people, to make it somehow emotionally weighty. I think one of the problems that you run into frequently in the left is a less willingness actually to go where people are, even as the politics are argued for as being for the people. There's a sense often that, well, those people are just yokels. I don't want to talk to them. And that kind of, I'm referring obviously more specifically to a kind of like the bourgeois leftist.
Yeah.
But there is a real problem of that. And there is a bit too much like the limousine liberalism, bourgeois leftist sort of phenomenon that does make it harder for us to put our own ideas in practice, because at the end of the day, people have to like your idea. They have to find it worthwhile in order to support it. And they're not going to support it unless you go where they are and talk to them about it.
It's well put. That's actually kind of gratifying. You have a similar background to me. I would also mention, actually, that in my general experience, that kind of sort of bourgeois leftist attitude represents really the lower quality work generally. The people who take that sort of attitude with respect to people in their conversations, I mean, with exceptions, unfortunately, mean people can do good scholarly work, but generally, I've seen that the quality does tend to diminish with the level of arrogance of the person. One thing that's always impressed me is that
I see a lot of that too. Yeah, I mean, and
yeah,
the more, this is one of the things that I think I found personally fascinating at as an academic. I mean, in my graduate school, I went through the whole critical theory emphasis. I was actually the only person in my incoming cohort of historians who went all the way through that and then took additional classes in theory, because I find this stuff fascinating. But I have a real pet peeve about the way a lot of these scholars write. I mean, I personally find a lot of post-structuralist theory really stimulating,
mm-hmm.
but it's garbage in terms of the way it's written. I mean, you're saying in a page and a half long paragraph what could be said in a couple of sentences. It just seems intentionally obtuse. And the more you do that, the more disconnected you are with the concerns of real people, and the less value the idea actually has in changing people's perspectives. I mean, I don't know, you could actually apply a little Gramsci here. There's a sense in which we have to engage with people in these discussions in order to shift the cultural foundations. If you're just otherwise like standing back from it and removed from it, you don't really have an impact.
And it's not just bad writing either, is it? It's also an arrogant tone. Like Wendy Brown, for example, is a fantastic theorist. Her book, Walled States Winning Sovereignty, is one of the best critiques of Schmidt I've ever seen. But at the same time, it's like it's written so obnoxiously. Like it really is just, don't even get me started on Judith Butler.
Yeah, I mean, and Judith Butler, my God, that stuff is so hard to read. But you can see this in just any number of interesting issues. And the more you come across with like a kind of smarmy smugness, I mean, I don't know, look at the way that Richard Dawkins turned people off, or Christopher Hitchens, whatever critique they might have had to make is ultimately lost because of the way they're doing it. They're essentially playing to a particular audience that's already converted.
Yeah.
And you're intentionally shutting out anybody that you could reach on a particular issue. We see this in so many different areas. And I think part of it is a kind of insularity. And I think certainly in the US too, it affects our overall politics, especially since in the early 1970s, the Democratic Party made a strategic decision to focus on the college educated and instead of the working class. And that's had tremendously negative impacts. And since then, you can see over and over again, they'll bring in all kinds of elite Ivy Leaguers. I mean, look at the kind of people that Obama brought in for his cabinet. I mean, just tons and tons of people with elite educations. Yeah. But I don't know, go back to the New Deal consensus. Hell, Harry Truman didn't even go to college at all. And they were willing to bring people in from, all walks of life because they wanted out of the box thinking. If you're only turning to elite educated professionals who have this disconnect from people, you're going to get the same predictable status quo thought that doesn't really get to our real concerns.
Well, that's actually kind of interesting. So, I mean, like people tend to talk about whether or not a person is specifically competent for the presidency or what have you. And of course, competence matters tremendously. There are tremendous stakes involved. But at the same time, it's like if you want a representative government of any sort, if you have only specially trained elites, which, by the way, I don't really think even the educated people who become the president can really be described as such for the job they're getting into, you're never going to have a leader who actually has skin in the game with respect to the plight of the average person in the United States. Yeah. But this actually leads in.
Stop electing millionaires and start electing people who really understand our concerns.
Yeah.
And I think that's an issue that there is a lot of agreement across left and right in the US. There's a similar kind of disdain for a lot of that out of touch elitism. But honestly, I think if we tried to use that a bit, in the same way that you see consensus on corruption, both sides agree that there's corruption, but the right is less willing to look at it when it's on their side, in the same way that the Democrats are less willing to criticize that elitism when it serves their purposes. I think if we can find a way to focus on the core concerns, though, there's a way to kind of like bring people together around those issues.
Somebody asked, I'm trying to find the name, but this is another question I saw, and this kind of leads into it. So somebody asked, do you have any evidence for why the right is more willing to accept hypocrisy than the left? I don't necessarily think that's true, but I think you've given an explanation for that. Is that it's not so much that the right is more willing to accept hypocrisy; it's that because the right is in sort of this constant state of war and distrust with respect to the rest of their society, they're willing to be more pragmatically accepting of bad behavior on the right if it seems to be effective. Because
it depends on where you want to take it, because you can answer that question in two different ways. One is to focus more on the strategic value and on the rhetoric, and in that case, scholars like Corey Robin are useful in looking at the way conservative thought has played out over the last 250 years. You consistently see the same patterns repeated again and again, and a lack of regard for hypocrisy is one of those if it serves the wider purpose. And then there's also the sociobiological or evolutionary psychological perspectives, which again, it's still a field in its infancy. It's only a few decades old, and there's tons of problems with it. Yeah. But it often does identify certain core perspectives that you see repeated over and over again. And I think some of that for me is stimulating and intriguing, especially since I can see the same basic debates happening over and over again, whether you're going back to the ancient Romans or Confucian China or whatever. You can see the same kind of arguments playing out over things like foreign influences or whether or not people are inherently good or bad, like whether they need strong authorities or not. There's all these same arguments that we see repeated again and again and again. Certain patterns. So it does suggest to me that there is a kind of co-evolutionary value to the perspectives that we have. I mean, just think back to our hunter-gatherer origins or whatever, wandering around in East Africa millions of years ago. Some people being naturally predisposed to experiment, to innovate, to take on a new idea and push forward, versus some people saying, oh, no, hold back, preserve what we have. I mean, they both provide value to the overall unit. One gives a sense of coherent identity that helps in educating the youth. The other provides the constant cultural evolution that you need. So there may be a kind of a foundation to that sort of thinking that we can see justifying the way that the survey material shows again and again that some people just don't care. It's just the hypocrisy is just not a concern for them. If it's on their side. It's similar to questions of corruption, because on the right you see people complain about corruption a lot. Trump was in fact. It was a genius move to stick with that whole drain the swamp idea, because it is an idea that they care about, even though he was one of the most corrupt administrations we've ever had. As far as a slogan, it's a good one, right? But it's also, if you take it too literally or seriously and miss the fact that conservatives often expect that their leaders are creaming a little off the top. They expect a certain amount of, they're rich, they earned it, they're powerful. I mean, we expect a little bit of bad behavior from them. Yeah. And that's not something that non-conservative thinkers are likely to take seriously. They wouldn't expect that. No. If you're against corruption, then you should not be corrupt at all. And little bits of that are kind of taken for granted. And I think even if that shows up again and again in surveys, there may be a kind of predisposition to it.
This goes back to theory and praxis, though, doesn't it? Because what if, in order to be successful, you need to engage in something a bit slimy? For example, one of the obviously the reason why we're only electing millionaires is because only millionaires can get themselves out there. They're the only ones who stand a chance, and even then, it's not guaranteed. Bernie Sanders, he was cast out ultimately. It's
well, yeah. I mean, he was blocked when you had most of the neoliberals drop out and endorse one of them. Because otherwise, Bernie did have a chance of winning the nomination. So they basically circled the wagons in defense of the status quo, and that was entirely predictable. The fact that he did so well in two different runs does tell you there is a hunger for this kind of politics. The problem there is if you pragmatically accept a little corruption to get in, then you are beholden to that corruption, and it's harder to change the system. If you get in enough progressives that are willing to change the system overall, then a lot of the people who got in and had the right ideals, but they did take some of that dirty money and they did do some of that, they'll see the writing on the wall and they'll join the coalition to change the laws.
Yeah.
But but I think if you give into it to begin with, I think we need more people who are not willing to, who are willing to keep pushing and keep fighting without it. Because I think that authenticity and that desire to run without the corrupting influences of the big money is powerfully appealing to voters as long as you can raise enough cash to actually reach people. I actually prefer what people like Bernie and AOC are trying to do in terms of funding and keep arguing that we have a kind of learned helplessness, I think, in more leftist politics, where we'll think, well, somebody can write a $10,000 check. I can't write that, so therefore there's nothing I can do. If people gave the price of a cup of coffee a month, like as a consistent recurring donation to a number of politicians that they like that were running on clean money, that's honestly all it would take. I mean, on the individual level, you think, well, $5, what can $5 buy? It's nothing, right? My $5 doesn't matter. But a few thousand people giving $5 a month gives you enough of a war chest to win most House races in the country. It's literally all it would take. And we have to convince enough people that it's worth doing. If they chip in then enough of the clean money politicians can actually run and win, and then we can change the laws around it that take that corruption just off the table.
That's the trick, though, isn't it, though? I mean, everybody accepts that if a large enough number of people sort of made that tiny little hit, they could actually make actual change. But it's a lack of faith that enough people will ever do that.
Right. And hence it's a kind of learned helplessness. We feel, well, it's just not going to happen. People aren't going to care, whatever. So I won't do it. Well, that's exactly what you're criticizing. That you're saying you wouldn't do it. So why should they do it? We have to be willing to take that chance and do it. We have to be willing to, put our money where our mouth is, or whatever, and again, you can do it without putting a whole lot out there. I mean, I'm not wealthy by any means. I couldn't afford significant contributions to anybody, but a few bucks here and there, I could afford to give the price of a coffee a month to help somebody, win a progressive race in Kansas or something. It's worth doing. And if enough people do it, it really does matter. And that's the way I would like to push back against the whole corrupting influence of big money. As soon as you pragmatically accept it, then you have opened the door to their influence on your policies. And if they influence your policies, it pushes you away from the concerns of ordinary people. Next thing you know, you're only having meetings with lobbyists and the people who have money, and then you become insulated. It gets to that same kind of disconnect, the whole theory and praxis issue. We have to stay focused on improving ordinary people's lives. And if we have to sit there and listen to oil executives, you're not going to pay attention to what would help ordinary people.
Well, people value democracy in name, but when it comes to actually taking part in the actual risks inherent in that, because it's one of the things that that's the downside to democracies, involves the personal risk of all members of the demos. How do you convince someone to take that chance when sort of the faint hope that enough people will do it isn't enough? Like, is there another argument you can think of?
Honestly, I don't know. It's a tough one, and it gets back again to a question you asked at the beginning, like how do we get people involved in the first place, and why are people like me relative rarities in politics anyway? I mean, it is difficult to convince people that it's worth the fight, especially when your chances are greater for losing than winning. But everything you do does matter, and there is a sense in which, I don't know, it's kind of like, dropping the few pebbles at the top of the hill, and it can pick up more and more and more and more. Next thing you know, you've got an avalanche, like every small movement does matter. In our run for 2020 here, we genuinely changed a lot of the conversation on the ground in this area. And we got people talking about issues they weren't really talking about. And we picked up, my single largest voting block in 2020 is not older voters. I mean, the boomers do vote in much higher numbers than anybody else does usually. My largest voting block were 18 to 24-year-olds. People actually saw somebody that was willing to speak for them, and they came out for that person. They're willing to do it. And there are a lot of people that started talking about issues that we just weren't doing in this area, and it actually picked me up a number of interesting crossover voters. I had people telling me, I'm voting for Trump and you. I'm like, my politics and Trump's are pretty much, but they see a similarity in the appeals to ordinary people. or longtime conservatives who were never Trumpers and did consider themselves to be conservatives and Republicans. And the kind of policies that I'm advocating are not typically conservative ones, but I often spoke in a way that at least gave them a certain amount of respect, and they could see that kind of integrity. And I think that's another one that one of the arguments you can use to tell people to get involved and to talk to people, because I mean, I've often told people in the area, you may disagree with me on this, that, or the other policy, but I'm always going to come back and talk to you, and I'm always going to listen. And I think a lot of people, that does resonate. And while it is difficult, over time, we make more and more of a difference. I think in this last election, you can see that quite a few, more conservative or blue dog Dems lost their seats in purple districts. Meanwhile, people running on unabashedly progressive leftist platforms in solidly red districts notched up record numbers of votes. I mean, the lesson should be clear in terms of what we should focus on and how we can reach people. And I think more people taking that up and more people willing to risk their $5 or getting involved directly in volunteering, it adds up.
No, I would agree. I would agree with that. I mean, it's what Jordan Peterson says, right? You need to clean your own room first. Exactly. Here's a good one. You actually mentioned this, that you studied critical race theory in school. Northern Observer asks, I don't know what this first thing means. Asks, is Condi X and the critical race phenomena a net positive or net negative or neutral for progressive politics?
I don't know that I would have a real opinion on that. I think to some extent, when we talk a lot about race and racism directly, it does make it a little harder to enact the policies that would have the greatest effect in addressing racism. But it's also hard to completely ignore the phenomenon of systemic racism and long-term cultural racism in the U.S. And certainly a lot of the backlash against it is deeply wrong-headed and fear-based. But again, that's just the fact that that's going to work. That you can take things like, I don't know, what is it, the 1609 initiative, whatever, when they're talking about the beginnings of slavery in the U.S. A change in the way we teach the history of the U.S. that takes for granted the long-term disadvantagement we've seen for significant chunks of the population. It actually terrifies some people, and the right can exploit that in order to draw them to their side. But if we focus a lot more on a lot of the core issues, the core systemic issues, like the socioeconomic issues, the lack of opportunity to advance yourself, the lack of education, then we do offer a certain path forward. I guess one thing that stands out to me is, look back to Dr. King's arguments. You go back into the 1960s here, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that he focused on the most was the economy, and he also talked about things like imperialism, and war, militarism. And these are things that the contemporary left often leaves off the table and wants to focus solely on the issue, the cultural issue of race, and all these big systemic factors that tie into it. And if you go back to the 1960s too, the black-white wealth gap in the U.S. was about 4 or 5 to 1, and today it's 10 to 1. They're much, much worse off today than when we had the civil rights struggles in the first place. We've been going in the opposite direction. And that is making it a lot harder to deal with a lot of these things because, the far right can point to violence in a lot of cities and say, look, see, black people bad, manipulate credulous people into being more racist. Racism is learned. It's not innate.
Well, I mean,
we're basically feeding those arguments by ignoring the underlying socioeconomic situation.
Yeah, and I think, and of course, systemic racism largely. I mean, not
the number. I was like blanking on the number. It was 1650.
It was 1609. I pulled it up.
1619. That's when the first Dutch slave ship, I think, arrived in the Virginia colony. I think that's where they're dating it from. But yeah, I can't remember the year. I'm terrible with years. It's funny for being a historian.
I looked it up on Wikipedia. You were right the first time. It's 1609.
Oh, that's not the. It's I don't know if it's the name of the project, but I don't know. Whatever. But okay. It's one of those.
Oh, no, you're right. Sorry, 1619. I think I just had a stroke or something. Anyways, I I mean, like systemic racism, of course, like as a slogan, is horribly abused, and it does, of course, it's specifically oriented. I mean, not solely, of course, but it's majorly oriented towards these sort of socioeconomic, like barriers to access or to social mobility or things like that.
Yeah, but a lot of the rhetoric isn't, and a lot of it
Oh,
seems
absolutely.
people are basically like they're preaching to the choir already. So as soon as you start talking about systemic racism and all the problems you run into, then yes, your liberal and left audience is immediately on board. And meanwhile, all the white working class dig their heels in and miss it because they've had a ton of like completely contrary influences hitting them.
Yeah.
I think that's a real problem, and it does present a certain quandary for us on the left because, yeah, we do need to be able to critically examine the history of racism in the U.S. and just how deeply problematic a lot of this is. But the way that we do it matters if you're trying to bring more people on board and widen your coalition, and that's, I guess, my argument. If
Absolutely.
we want ultimately to solve the problem, then we need to bring people on board and find a way to reach them and pitch it to them. And if we're only preaching to the converted, it's going to keep getting worse. And people can continue to exploit that background of racism and those long-term trends in order to push us to more and more reactionary politics. And that frankly terrifies me.
It's the word racism, though, isn't it? Because the average person for the last 20 or so years, they hear the word racist, and what they think to themselves isn't, here's a structural bent towards disadvantaging specific groups in society. They think of it as racism is a conscious bigotry towards other people. This is like a cruel disposition that you have. And then you have people on the left who will unfortunately sort of use the idea of systemic racism properly in their heads to identify problems in society, but then simultaneously use that as a justification for calling individuals racist in the former sense. And that's largely been the problem here. It's
back to that whole, like, you're just dumb yokels or whatever, and you're tuning people out, and ultimately it doesn't help to solve the problems at all. So it is tricky, and it gets back a little to that question about theory and praxis. We have to be aware of the theory, and we have to be aware of these deeper issues, but we have to find a better way to pitch our arguments to people in a way that's actually going to work and that's not going to put people on the defensive. You get this a lot too. As soon as you call someone a racist or a bigot or whatever, then it's a deeply personal assault, and they start thinking about their own life, and they don't feel particularly prejudiced. Granted, a lot of people really are without recognizing it because they do acquiesce to a lot of the systemic stuff around them, but it's not very conscious. It's not like a kind of, I don't know, crazy Sieg Heil commitment that they have. They're not all wearing Klan hoods or something. Most people who are racist don't think of themselves as racist.
Yeah.
And if you start off with what they take as a kind of personal insult, it makes it harder to make the argument. It's the same thing with a lot of labels you find in society too. I mean, I find it particularly difficult to discuss the drift into authoritarian populist rhetoric because, as soon as you bring up the F word, as soon as you bring up fascism, then people think of Hitler and concentration camps and, extermination, all that kind of stuff. And they're like, well, that doesn't happen, so Trump not fascist. Well, I don't know. I mean, Metaxas didn't create death camps, Salazar didn't create death camps. Most fascists did not. Hitler is the exception, not the rule. But it's the negative association they have. So as soon as the word comes out, it's not taken in its political philosophy sense. It's not taken in an objective way. It's taken as a personal insult. That makes it impossible to discuss something.
Well, this is where the creep comes in, right? Because especially like if, for example, you look at people like Richard Spencer, for example, like undeniably racist in the strong sense, in the derogative sense. But when you look at how they describe sort of the relationships between how they characterize racial groups, they're really, in certain key respects, however disingenuously, they're taking to the logical conclusion the sort of imperialist colonial framing of nations and states that more or less everybody else just takes for granted within sort of that liberal, that sort of uncritical sphere. Like it gets really tricky because in a perverse sense, they are sort of egalitarian. They're just very cruel about it. And of course, they're misattributing identity to poorly identified entities, of course, but that's a whole other issue.
Right. I mean, obviously, concepts like race are extremely nebulous and not really scientific in the first place. So, yeah, I mean, you can manipulate them in a number of ways, in the same way that nationalist movements as a whole are. And I think that, again, is where one of the reasons that liberals have historically been terrible at counteracting fascist arguments is that liberalism, too, does acquiesce to the basic structure of the nation state.
Yeah.
And the foundations of the modern nation state are in a kind of racist ethno-nationalism. There are deep problems in those assumptions. And without that itself being critiqued, it's hard to then effectively counteract those arguments. You're in essence already kind of like halfway agreeing with them, and that makes it hard to argue against it. Which is one of the reasons, again, I think we need to revitalize more of the left in the West if we're going to be able to face off against the appeal of a lot of this politics now.
Yeah, I mean, the irony, of course, is that ultimately fascist conceptions of politics are inherently parasitic on liberal ones.
I mean, the fact that so much of the so-called liberal world is still deeply imperialistic. I mean, and you'll see that from from Trudeau or Biden or whatever. I mean, there are so many ways in which they're already committed to things that are explicitly right-wing, even while their social politics, are much more open. But because they have halfway surrendered already to the more problematic assumptions on the right, it's harder then to effectively critique and neuter those arguments on the right itself.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think we'll break because I've kept you for 2 hours, and I don't want either of us to die from blood clots. So.
Oh yeah.
Here, there's a good one. Here we go.
Having fun, right?
Here's oh no, this has been great. Horizonberg asks, so here's a nice way to end it. In the next 10 to 20 years, how likely do you think an attempted coup by a right-wing coalition in the United States would be? If this is a major concern, what should leftists do to prepare for that possibility?
I would say on our current course, it's inevitable. And a lot of the current maneuvering that you're seeing today under Trump is laying a lot more of that foundation. There have been things that come very close to it. I mean, in fact, the Supreme Court's decision in 2000 was effectively a judicial coup. I mean, they even wrote into their decision that it couldn't be used for future precedent. I mean, it was deeply disingenuous in its politics, but technically legal. Although, again, fascists generally came to power through completely legal means. They then just completely subverted and dismantled all those institutions. Yeah. Trump's attempt, obviously, to overturn the results of the election, since they didn't go his way, is an attempt at another coup. Whether it extends into the military or things like that, that's a lot more questionable. Although in the long run, it does become a little bit more likely if we continue on the same path. But at this point, the military as a whole is a professional institution, and its loyalty is overall to the constitutional order. So I don't see the possibility there. And in the same way that, I mean, there's no real likelihood of a civil war in the U.S. That's just a bizarre fantasy a lot of people have. It's not going to. We don't have any of the signs impending of a civil war, but we do have a deep enough polarization in perspectives that one side or the other overthrowing the state and changing that order is going to happen. I mean, the fact that people haven't even noticed just how much we've declined. They're just not consciously aware. The U.S. is down to 52nd in the world now in individual freedoms. And you still have people all like waving the flag and like freest country in the world. And like, it's clearly not. And the people you're voting for are the reason that it's not. But all they're hearing is the rhetoric. And if a lot of that rhetoric continues to say the media is the enemy, the other party is the enemy, the institutions are the enemy, then you're more and more willing to accept an overtly authoritarian coup in the name of preserving freedom. That's terrifying to me. And only Trump's overall incompetence really prevented him from being likely to see any of this sort of to fruition. But he's laying a lot of dangerous groundwork that future demagogues can pick back up. I think a lot of his current maneuvering is intended much more to build on that grievance politics that's so common on the right, and to guarantee his future in politics, the way he can continue to influence things and play kingmaker and whatnot. And that's the bigger danger, is to continue to feed that sort of grievance, the sense that this election was entirely illegitimate. People will never accept it. There'll be massive obstruction, and you'll have more and more, essentially QAnon nutters winning primaries. That's the longer term effect of Trumpism, and that's where we are headed toward a coup. This republic will fall on its current course. We do need to change direction.
I have a slightly different theory, and what I think is going to happen. I mean, I'm interested in particular in how all of these Republicans who are either more extreme than Trump or just simply more cynical than Trump, whatever that means, that they were all willing to go along with this patently absurd conspiracy mongering about the election. The results of the recounts, of course, have not necessarily been in his favor, and to the extent they have, by a slim margin. I don't think that there's really the will for anything like a coup in the violent sense that somebody would be afraid of. I think the coup has already begun, and that was the degeneration of the political right into a giant grift engine and really nothing more.
And that's been underway actually for several decades, which is why, again, I said Trump was inevitable, and something worse than Trump is inevitable on this current course. One of your viewers, I opened a little comment thing on the side here, mentioned the Fidesz party in Hungary. And it's a brilliant connection. It's something that you can see in a lot of these same authoritarian populist movements. And there is a real drift toward a kind of illiberal democracy underway in the developed world. And Trumpism is a part of that phenomenon. And that's the real danger for a coup, is that it's going to follow entirely legal, frame. I mean, in the same way that Mussolini came to power legally, despite basically leading a criminal gang, beating people up in the streets, but still subverted those institutions. We're going to continue to see that.
Yeah. Now, are we ethically sort of vulnerable to a kind of mass extermination policy like we saw in Nazi Germany? I don't necessarily think so. I think what instead will probably happen is just kind of this almost sounds Marxian, but like a fading away of politics until it just becomes kind of machine-like and sort of dead and hopeless and callous. That's kind of how I see it.
The reasons that 100 million Americans don't bother to vote. Yeah, I mean,
exactly.
People feel increasingly unrepresented by these systems, and the more they check out from them, the more likely that kind of minority government is. I mean, no fascist polity ever had majority popular support, but all it takes is a fervently committed minority to seize the levers of power and reshape things. And I don't think we need anything like a violent coup to take place if you can continue to subvert institutions from the inside. And I think that's what we're seeing all across Europe and in the US at this point here. We're basically on track to become a managed democracy in the way that like Russia exists, right? Clearly an authoritarian state, but with all the trappings of elections and whatnot. That I think is our future in this country if we don't manage to turn things around and really change the way we talk to each other.
Somebody mentioned Carl Schmitt in the conversation. Of course, his critique of Weimar was specifically that it wasn't willing to. It viewed politics in the wrong way. It viewed politics as sort of a game in which there were these set rules that are above everything else. Ultimately, nobody is required to do anything active or take a decision. It's a sieve through which things get filtered, and the product comes out at the end, and that's how it's supposed to go. And I suppose my final question to you is, what do you think is the appropriate way to view the domain of politics itself, sort of in a normative sense? Like, are we supposed to view politics as a state of affairs that we are trying to establish, or as an activity that we constantly have to engage with? Because I think that's really where the tension comes from. People want desperately to sort of be a part of this agonistic back and forth debate. There's a tremendous market for it, as we've seen with the rise of alternative media, of course, when mainstream media has been unwilling to accommodate that. But at the same time, there is this strong idea that politics should sort of be treated passively and sort itself out. And that's kind of where, I suppose that's kind of where so much of this this apathy comes from. I don't know.
Often that politics is something that people do to each other, in a sense that, the small active minorities will push their party in power, and politics is done to the world. It's not really seen as much as open to participation, and part of that is just the corruption of big money in the first place. The barriers to entry are very high, but people getting involved at the local level and getting involved in their county parties and in the local institutions, it really does have an important cascading effect. And I think it's difficult to convince people that politics shouldn't be a spectator sport. It's supposed to be something that we're actively engaged in.
Yeah.
It has to become personal. And I think one of the tricks there is it's similar to any other issue where you want to change the approach that people take, the basic perspective they have. You need to somehow make it personal for them. You need to show them that staying outside of this and doing nothing is actually a decision, and it's one that's harmful to you. Yeah. And make them feel more invested in what's going on. And I think one of the ways to help do that too, and one of the reasons for that sort of insurgency within the parties, is that if we give people politicians that they can trust more, that seem more relatable and are willing to speak for them and actively collaborate with them as opposed to preaching or talking down to them, then I think it'll be easier for people to stay interested in and sustain that interest in politics. Whereas it doesn't matter how much money you dump into the next fad politician, if they're not really actively engaging with you, at the end of the day, you just, those movements fizzle out and people drift away from them. We need to find a way to bring more people in who are willing to work with people and continue that direct engagement, and on that basis build a kind of politics from the ground up.
I agree. Absolutely. Professor O'Mara, thank you very much for coming on. It's been really enjoyable.
My pleasure.
I hope it wasn't too exhausting, but anytime you want to come back, just let me know. I'll probably invite you back on in the future at some point. But thank you very much. You have a good day. And
you too. These are always fun.
Yeah.
Thanks much to your audience and all the questions.
Yeah, thanks guys for asking questions and for watching, of course. So take care. Have a safe holidays, and best to you.
And you as well. Have a good day.